the Second World War left a huge mark on human history. The scars it left, the suffering during the war, and the millions of people who lost their lives. Wars have had a great impact on the development of humanity. Perhaps the fact that such a great catastrophe happened prevents the outbreak of a new world war today. The destructive power of wars, the inadequacies of states and armies fighting with great splendor. In the Second World War, an unprecedented war in world history, the US's involvement in the war changed all the balances. So how do you think the US got involved in the war? Now, if you are ready, we can examine the Pearl Harbor raid and the US involvement in the war together. If you are ready and like this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share your ideas in the comments. Here we go. At 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes filled the skies over Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, raining bombs and shells down on ships anchored below. At 8:10 a.m., a 1,800-pound bomb tore through the deck of the battleship USS Arizona and landed in its forward ammunition magazine. The ship exploded and more than 1,000 men were trapped inside. Then, torpedoes pierced the battleship USS Oklahoma. With 400 sailors aboard, the Oklahoma lost its balance, turned on its side and sank. In just 2 hours, the Japanese destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American ships and more than 300 aircraft. Some 2,500 soldiers were killed and 1,000 wounded. The day after the attack, an enraged President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan, to thunderous applause. Hearing the details of the attack on the news, Congress and millions of Americans shared the president's outrage and commitment to defend the nation. Young men flocked to recruiting stations for the armed forces, and Congress quickly voted in favor with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Japan's allies Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States, and Congress once again responded. After years of debate and controversy and more than 2 years of fighting, the United States had finally joined World War II. Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya, then a British colony, a few hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, a larger Japanese force was landing off neutral Thailand. What the Japanese called Operation Hawaii was a supporting offensive. The real blow was Operation South, aimed at Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. And Japan had already been in an all-out war against China for 4.5 years. On November 26, 1941, American Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented a note to the Japanese. It was not an ultimatum, as is sometimes suggested, but rather a statement of what was necessary to normalize relations. According to the note, this required the withdrawal of Japanese troops from China and Indochina. When the Hull note was issued, Japanese forces were already on the move to carry out Operations South and Hawaii. The Japanese warships of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force began moving on November 17 to a forward base in the Kuriil Islands in northern Japan. They sailed for Pearl Harbor on the 26th. It was also one of the best planned and best prepared operations of the Second World War. It involved the clandestine passage of an entire fleet, including 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships and 3 cruisers, over a distance of some 3,700 miles across the North Pacific. The escorting destroyers quickly ran out of fuel oil, and refueling at sea was a new technique that could not be carried out in inclement weather. If any of the Japanese ships were damaged during the Battle off Hawaii, it would be extremely difficult to bring them home. There were strong reasons why American military leaders considered an attack on Hawaii impractical. The operation was inspired by Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the United Fleet. Its most important critic was an officer senior to Yamamoto, Admiral Nagano, the Chief of Staff of the Navy. Nagano had less confidence in air power and was wary of risking a large part of the fleet in a remote operation. He was particularly reluctant to risk the entire aircraft carrier force so far out of Japan at a time when Japan was planning attacks against Malaya and the Philippines thousands of miles away. Yamamoto demanded the use of all 6 major carriers and had to threaten to resign to get a decision in his favor. About 26 Japanese cruiser submarines were concentrated around the Hawaiian Islands, given the task of intercepting any American ship that survived the main air attack. 5 small 2-man submarines launched from larger submarines attempted to enter the harbor early on December 7 but failed. An American destroyer sank one of the boats at the entrance to Pearl Harbor about an hour and 15 minutes before the air attack began, almost costing Japan the element of surprise. This was, paradoxically, the main reason why American and British intelligence failed to predict the attack on Pearl Harbor. Too much information about Japanese preparations was obtained from the interception of diplomatic correspondence. These were assumed to relate more to a move to Thailand, Malaya or the Dutch East Indies than to Hawaii or the Philippines. A war warning was sent to American commanders in the Pacific on November 24. President Franklin D. Roosevelt also gave informal assurances to the British that the United States would support Britain and Japan if they went to war. There is no evidence that either President Roosevelt or Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave advance warning of the attack on Pearl Harbor. There were many long-range U.S. aircraft in the Pacific, but they were not used to protect Hawaii. A force of B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers was sent to the Philippines by the U.S. Army. The 80 PBY Catalina flying boats available to the Navy were allocated to the Philippines or for offensive actions against the Japanese-held Marshall Islands. On December 7, in the attack on Battleship Row, 2 former battleships, Arizona and Oklahoma, were damaged beyond repair by bomb or torpedo hits. Of the 2,026 American sailors and Marines killed in the attack, 1,606 were on board these 2 ships. Only 218 Army personnel were killed in the raid. The ships were salvaged, but 2 did not return to service until 1944, partly because they were undergoing extensive modernization. 3 more ships, Pennsylvania, Maryland and Tennessee, suffered only minor damage. They were in dry dock on Battleship Row or moored inside. In any case, none of the 6 survivors were fast enough to operate with carrier task forces in later combat operations. 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were at sea on December 7, and none of the heavy cruisers were damaged. For the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic, 3 modern aircraft carriers were available, as well as 2 modern battleships and 6 older warships. More on the events in the second video. Don't forget to follow us.